Okay.
And here we're,
Lamed, which parak?
yeah, we're
Lamed
doing
Gimel.
Lamed Gimel, is it? We're doing parak?
Lamed Gimel,
Okay.
chapter Lamed Gimel, Pasuk Gimel.
Pasuk Gimel. Lamed Gimel.
Not from the
Okay.
coffee, but the concept.
Here we go.
And we're dealing, Be'ez Hashem, with the historical meeting after 22 years between Yaakov Avinu and Esau. What they meet up after a whole Havdoma that Yaakov Avinu sent to find out what's going on. Mm-hmm. Whether Esau actually spoke with the angels or with the messengers according to the Lord Mephoshim, whether he really knew that Yaakov had sent to him as an issue amongst the great Mephoshim. But nonetheless he did, and there was a whole leader, and then he sent a whole mincha lefono, so that Rashi tells us that he was ready for three things, Yaakov Avinu. He was ready for davening, he was prepared to pray to Hashem, but if he saw that maybe Hashem wasn't answering 100% his tefillah, b'inyan zeh, why would he suspect that Hashem wouldn't answer his tefillah? The Gemara tells us in Masechta Brachos that Yaakov was always very, very, and Rashi mentions it here, that Yaakov Avinu was very, very self-critical, and he was always under the impression that maybe all the promises which Hashem had given him, maybe he'd blown it in some way. Shema Yigrim HaChet, as the expression has it. Maybe the Chet might cause, he might have fallen into some sort of Chet. So this Rashi brings on the Pasuk K20, Mikol HaChodim and Mikol HaEmer, that Rashi brings that Yaakov Avinu saw that maybe he'd become small in his number of zchuyot, his merit list had dropped. Why? Because Shema nishlachlachti b'chet. Maybe I became grubby with a chet. And this is a rather unusual expression in Rashi, because that doesn't occur in the Medrash, not in the Gemara. That expression, Shema nishlachlachti b'chet. Well, from that it would appear that when you do a chet, you get grubby. Something, as the old saying have it, something rubs off. There's something occurs in your life that it's already a problem. And we're approaching Yutes Kislev now. The old Rabbi writes in Tanya that if Cholila you've become a Rosha, but according to Tanya, it's not hard to be in the club of the Rishonim. Yes, it's. I once heard from a very leading chassid that he once sort of smiled at a Fabrean, and he said, "I'm going to join up with all the Rosh Yeshivas." He said, "In the Rosh Hashanah club," he said.
Wow.
I think he was being a little bit overstated, but there's nonetheless there's a point to that. Anyway, Rashi says that if you're in the the Alter Rebbe says, if you're in the Rosh club, then you have to tshuva. You can't just start serving from now on. Why? Because you've got to get rid of all the stuff, all the what you might call the mud, which is collected over your time of being a Rosh. Before you become into the Bainai group, then you've got to get rid of all the
schmutz,
the grubby material that will interfere. And that's what Rashi is hinting at, we can suggest, that he says that Shema nishlachlachti b'chet. Rashi is hinting that's one on, that Rashi is very much into Pnimis Hatorah as well, that you became, maybe I'll become grubby, there's something between me and Elokus which won't allow me to function directly in the Inyan von Elikud. But by the way, just if we're already mentioning Yud Tish Kislev, this has got nothing to do with it, but I suppose it does. Ultimately, it does have to do with it, and that is, you know, that in the Alter Rebbe's time, immediately after the Alter Rebbe got out, there was the previous Tsar, which had been, he passed away, and there was a new Tsar. And that fellow was he was like the heir, family-wise, but he was really bad news, personally-wise. He was a very, very unpleasant guy. His name was Nikolai, or Nikolai, I need to sit in at the table if you don't mind, yeah? Because there's an old cloud that people who sit in the peanut gallery end up chewing peanuts. Yeah? Sorry.
Okay.
Great. So,
Don't worry, I'll give you peanuts later.
so towards the end, before the Alter Rebbe got out of the prison, which was miraculous and amazing, the whole story, they took the Alter Rebbe out of his cell for a interrogation, which before the Alter Rebbe actually got out, the interrogations were much, much more intense and sort of venomous than what they were at the beginning. That's very interesting. Anyway, they took the Alter Rebbe out to this place, and then they were bringing the Alter Rebbe back to his cell. And in the courtyard of the prison, they were playing two grown-up boys were playing in the courtyard. And one of them was this young heir that he's going to be the next Tsar, this Nikolai. And he was very, very unpleasant type. So he saw the Alter Rebbe being led by the captives back to the cell, and he always played with a stick. He was always beating people. He was very unpleasant. And so he came up to the Alter Rebbe, and he lifted up his stick like this to thwack with his stick the Alter Rebbe. So the Alter Rebbe gave him a look. The Alter Rebbe looked him in the face. He gave a very severe look, and he's in the middle, like that, bringing down the stick. The stick fell out of his hands onto the ground. And the Alter Rebbe just looked at him and nodded slightly, and then the Alter Rebbe walked on. He was just thunderstruck by this look, and he dropped the stick. So later on, he only held the Malucha for a very short time, Baruch Hashem. Then the one after that was called Alexander, and he was the one that fought Napoleon. And he was the one that the Alter Rebbe was his ally. The Alter Rebbe helped him, assisted him. And he was a decent guy. But this Nikolai was really bad news, and he pegged away younger high, Baruch Hashem. So they say, and it's put down in the Kluti Diburim here, the Friedrich Rebbe says that the Alter Rebbe brought him down. You understand? The Alter Rebbe gave him a cook, and the stick is a sign of Malucha, you understand? Of kingship. They had to call it royalty. And that fell out of his hands. They're finished with him. You understand? He was only a few years. He did a lot of trouble for the few years that he was, but the Alter Rebbe had to fixed him up. So
who was Alexander?
Huh?
Who was Alexander?
Who was Alexander?
Yeah.
I don't know. There was a Tsar called Alexander.
All right.
He was the king. He was the one who followed. Yeah. And he was a very quiet and liberal type of individual, and he didn't know a great deal about war and all that sort of thing, but he was very courageous. He wanted to be good, you know. So those who did, and they worked on him and got things going. But he actually took part in the battles, even though he didn't know a great deal of what was going on. All right, so now we have this historical meeting where Yaakov Avinu looks up and he sees that Esav is coming, and he divides his family into different groups and so on. Well, we won't go into all those details. And then, when he sees that Esau is actually approaching, then in our pasuk it's written, "V'hu over lifneihem," that he went over in front of them, "Vayishtachu arzo sheva piyomim," and he bowed down to the ground seven times, ad gishtoi el ochiv, until he actually approached or reached, as you might say, his brother. Vayorotz Esav likrosei, and Esav ran to meet him, literally, v'yechabkehu, and he embraced him, v'yipel al tzavaro, and he fell onto Yaakov Avinu's neck, like embraced him on the neck, v'yishokehu, and he kissed him, v'yivku, and they wept. Comes along Rashi, and Rashi says that this is pretty mind-boggling. I mean, Yaakov Avinu is Yaakov Avinu. He's been promised by his father in the brothers that he got from his father that Esau is going to be serving him, and going to be bottled to him. And yet, nonetheless, we see what appears to be a very big battle on Yaakov Avinu's path to Esau. Beklal, to bow down to him, seems to be a rather extremity. I mean, it's not enough that he bowed down to him once, but he bowed down to him 7 times. And that's pretty heavy going. And then Esau runs to him and embraces him and kisses him. So Rashi says that what's all this business? So it begins with our expression over lifneihem. So according to Rashi, who went in front of who? Who over lifneihem? Somebody went in front of them. So who is them? The family. All the people that he'd arranged in different groups. And it would appear that it means that Yaakov Avinu, he went in front of Esau. I'm sorry, in front of his family, and he presented himself first to Esau. That's exactly what Rashi says. Rashi says, over lifneihem, Omar, he said to himself, Im yovoi oisa rosha, if this particular rosha will come lehilochem to fight, yilcham bi tchila, he'll meet up with me first. And he'll fight me first, and in the meantime, all my family will have a chance to run away and hide. First way he'll fight up with me. But Rashi learns that what is this over lifneihem? It's a pure human matter. Yaakov Avinu was acting with Rachmanas miyuchedes l'gabi his family, and was courage enough to say that he would take on Esau first. Vayichabkehu, and Esau then ran to meet him, and then Esau kissed him, and he says nizgalgulu rachamo, that Esau really hated Yaakov, but at that particular moment his mercies, that he called nizgalgulu, they sort of rolled around inside him and came out. They came out mercy. Kishera'ohu mishtachave kol mishtachavois ho'elo. When he saw that Yaakov bowed down all these bowings, well, that's what made his rachamim come out. In other words, if somebody really is mevatel himself to you, then you feel a certain sort of obligation to be sort of nice to him. In other words, not that Esau really intended being nice, but he saw all this hishtachavoya on the part of Yaakov, so his rachamim came out, and then Rashi said, "V'yishokeu," and he kissed him. However, there are nakudas in the actual Sefer Torah. The Sefer has to write on each letter a dot. at the top of the Asia. And that's what we call Nokud or Nakuda. And that is always a sign, according to the Gemara and other places, that means you have to interpret this in a special way. You don't just take it purely as it implies. He said, "V'yesh cholchim b'dova, Nokudolo." And that means we're going to learn it a special way. He said, in that itself, the different opinions. How do we learn it specially? So he said, yes, cholchim b'dova zeh, but Brisa de Sifri. This is way over in Pasha Baloischa somewhere. It's not here. Yesh dorshu nakuda zu, yeloima shaloi no shoche b'chol liboy. He said there are some people who learn the nakuda that since Esau really hated Yaakov, and this was just a little bit of a rachamin that had come out, or when he kissed him, he didn't kiss him with absolute sincerity. It was just, a type of formality that he did, but really, he was still his enemy. Mm-hmm. So therefore he didn't kiss him with his whole heart. Then Omar Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Now you guys have heard of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai.
Mm-hmm.
Huh?
Yes.
So, and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is a Tana. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is the author of the Zohar Kodesh. And all the Pnimis HaTorah with all the amazing things all came from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Which means that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, he's got, a tremendous vista in whatever he said. Yeah, he's into everything in Nigla. He's meant throughout the whole Mishnah and Gemara. Everywhere there's not any Masechta or any Inyan, doesn't mention Rabbi Shimon somewhere. Yeah, and of course the whole Zohar Kodesh is full of him, plus Medrashim and all that. So, Omer Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, halacha hi. It's a halacha b'yadua she'Esav sein leYaakov. It's a halacha that Esau hates Yaakov. Well, I say everybody took that very calmly. So he said, "B'yadua she'Esau sein leYaakov. Ella shenichmaru rachmo bo'ezah shoho." At that particular moment, here before Rashi said nishgalglu rachmo, and here he says nichmaru rachmo. What's the difference? Nichmaru means it got warmed up. Yeah, it gets warmed up and sort of comes out. So therefore, Esau, he was hating Yaakov and he hates him, and right up to this last minute, he's also hating him. But he got a bit sort of stirred up by this whole Ishtachavoyas with the Elazachim. And when he saw all that, so then Rashi says he really still hated Esau, but he had a moment where some warmth came into him. He warmed up. Nichmar rachamo bo'ezah shov v'noshoche b'chol liboy. So Rashi said, despite his hatred, he actually kissed him sincerely.
Second time.
He actually kissed him with the whole heart. But there's two very interesting opinions. The first opinion doesn't say that you have to say it's a halacha that Esau hates Yaakov. Yeah? And yet, nonetheless, he didn't kiss him with his whole heart. This one says the opposite. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, he says that it's for sure, absolutely, he was hating him. But nonetheless, something happened and he warmed up and he kissed him with his whole heart. We need a megaphone to reach you.
Yeah.
So us of the Shaila, what is this business of halacha hi b'yadua sheYaakov Esau sein leYaakov? Anybody got any suggestions? I mean, a halacha applies to a din, For example, this morning after the davening, I told you a halacha when I get to Krishna. And I hope everybody remembers it, because it's very important. Halacha.
Yeah.
We mention halacha like Rabbi Krishna. That's halacha. Yeah? What sort of halacha that Esau is saying it as Yaakov? What sort of halacha is that? I mean, what do I paskin?
He is such a
Maybe
hatred
I
for him, it's like
paskin
it's
is
halacha.
you got to be careful of this Esau guy.
He had such an intense hate, and his descendants will also have such a big hate for Yaakov. The descendants of Esau and all of his Toldos will have such a hatred for Yaakov and Yidden that's like it's halacha for them, basically. That's what I'd say.
Very good.
But it says, it doesn't say that the halacha is that Esau hated Jacob. It says that the halacha is that he kissed him.
No.
No?
He says,
Halacha biyadua.
Halacha biyadua she'Esau seina leYaakov. That's the halacha. You can know for sure.
Right.
So once again, it's talking about your knowledge. It's not really saying what is, what sort of halacha is this.
Right.
So we have to understand that
We say that because halacha is eternal. We're saying that it's absolute. It's absolute because it's halacha that Esau must say Yaakov. So even now,
it's getting close to it.
Mashiach now.
That because of the absoluteness of the hatred, then we say it's halacha. That's not a bad point. That's good. So what is the way I would explain it is like this. What is halacha? You got all sorts of KLALI halacha in the Gemara, so they make sense up to a certain point. You can say that wherever you got Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda, then we always pass according to Rabbi Yossi. Exactly why, it's not you can maybe be mafalfa, but the actual halacha is l'mayla mitavadah. The Indian of halacha is the will of Hashem. Torah's got two aspects to it. Chokmosei v'ratzonai. Chokmosei means the aspects of Torah that they came through Sfiras HaChokmah in a revealed way. And therefore we can understand them up to a certain extent, and at least have some sort of appreciation according to Seichel Adam. Rotzen Hashem's will. That's the Maila Mitavadas, just like by yourself. Your will really doesn't reckon very much with your reasoning. Maybe it should, but it doesn't. We see that Rotzen is something the Maila Mitavadas. Esau's hatred for Yaakov is legamri l'mayla me ta'avadas. Yeah, it's l'mayla me the hagbola of reasoning. It's something. That's why I praised what is your name, please?
Avram Pink.
Avram.
Yeah.
That's why I praised what Avram said. Absoluteness pretty much gets into that field. What I'm saying. And it's a inyan which is completely beyond Talmud. And therefore Rashi says that Rabbi Shimon says a very big chiddush. And what is a big chiddush? That you can be sure that Esau hates Yaakov. And this is l'mayla mitavadas. It has no achiza in Matzias. No matter what will be, he hates him. Of Amira, that's the halacha. That's the concept of halacha.
Like Arabs.
Yeah. Amira, he says this is the tremendous thing that happened at this moment. That even though Esau, he hates Yaakov, but Maila Mikol Madidavak Bola. Higher than all Tam Vadas, Ainless a called Matthias. Together, so Matthias, it's a tremendous hatred. Nonetheless, at that moment, he kissed him when he saw her. So we have to say that Rashi's learning also a rather unusual thing. Rashi's saying because of all these hishtachavoyas, and he saw all these haknois, that he caught these, surrenderings that Yaakov, made to him. Well, that sort of kilo boiled in him, a sort of a softening of a sort. And he also did something which is l'mayla mitam fatas. He kissed him when he saw according to Reb Shimon. Rashi comes in with a very interesting but slightly disturbing message. And we said that Rashi's message is that you can ultimately find an eight of a Esav, and you can catch him at certain very remarkable moments, and he might really sort of like you for a few minutes. But there's a big price. In order to do that, you've got to be over nice to him, you know. In other words, you've got to bow down, you know, and really slightly overdo it in order to get to this. You follow? That's what we would assume is Rashi's message. So, as I say, on the one hand, that's encouraging. But mitzad hasheni, it's a bit, you know, tatlo. So it comes along. You guys have heard of him. I've got him, but you guys don't have him. The Rabbeinu Ovadia Saporno, that's his name. He was after Rashi. He was quite a bit later in history, but he's a Rishon, the Saporno, and he also goes according to the Pshat. But he's got different approaches than what Rashi has to the Pshat. But in this particular case, he, how do you say, he pretty much goes in the same inyan as Rashi. And he says that Esav came running to see Yaakov because at that moment his heart was reversed. Pach, liboy. So that's very much in the derech of Rashi, that his heart is really hotline hatred for Yaakov, but at that particular moment it became reversed because of all the hachnois. How do you say the word hachnois? Hachna'ah. Like self-surrendering and like self-over-giving of yourself. It's called hachna'ah. When he saw all the hachnois of Yaakov, then he sort of, he's normally not like that at all, but his heart became reversed at that moment. Now he brings a very amazing thing. He said, how do we know this? That this is a good approach? You know, it's a little bit sort of hard going. So he said, how do we know this is a good approach? He said, there's a Gemara. He doesn't bring the Gemara's name, but this happens to be the case. It's a Gemara in Masechta Tainim. And there was a great Novi, one of the early Noviim, and I'm going to make a little test to see where you guys have all heard of him. And if you haven't, then I'll be very surprised. And his name was Shiur Hashiloini. And he was a big Novi. And he lived a long time. And he lived into the time of the latter Malachim, but he was part of the Bezdin of David HaMelech. He was one of the Poiskim on the Bezdin of David HaMelech, and he was a very great Novi. Shiur Hashiloini. You guys never heard of him?
So familiar.
You guys, you're Shvacha Chabadskis. All the Chabadskis know, as foretelling for him, that who was the teacher of the Baal Shem Tov that made the Baal Shem Tov the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov was always a great person, but that he became what he became, the Baal Shem Tov, he must have a very high rating teacher. So who is his teacher? Very nice. Shiur Hashiloini. Shiur Hashiloini, he appeared many times to the Baal Shem Tov, and he taught him. Yeah. Which would indicate that Shiur Hashiloini is a very special sort of a novice, not stone. And the truth is that he occurs in all sorts of interesting issues. And he has something very, what you might call, fitting and powerful to say under many different circumstances. So, what does he say here? And he begins with a pasuk. Don't talk in the middle, guys, if you don't mind. So he says, he begins with a pasuk. And this is a pasuk in Mishlei, where it says, Toivim petzoyei oihem. It's much better the wounds of a person who loves you, not good are the neshikois oyev. if an enemy kisses you, that's not good. That's not going to bring anything good. But if a person who loves you beats you up, and he gives you even patoi, bruises, that's good for you. That's great. Because he really loves you. I see you guys are a little bit sort of, you know, sort of, you don't know, you never heard stories about